Good evening, everyone. My name is James Crabtree. Welcome to this evening discussion from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here in Singapore. Welcome in particular to our new and returning students. For those of you who are not students, this is the start of term, albeit a virtual term, which is why we're having a virtual event this evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome Sebastian Strangio joining us here from Adelaide in Australia to discuss the launch of his excellent new book, In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. It's a particularly timely topic, given the role that Southeast Asia is playing in the ongoing geopolitical tussle between the United States and China. So Sebastian, with a journalist's elegant timing, has published his book at a moment of maximum interest. Sebastian, I don't know if you want to wave a cover of this book, just so everyone can see it. Those who are waiting, there we go, In the Dragon's Shadow. Excellent book, full of praise on the front and back covers from all the right people. Sebastian's book, which I have had the pleasure of reading, gives a really terrific overview, both of the role that China plays in this region, and of course also the United States, but also the complexity and nuance of our own region in this part of the world as it tries to grapple with a new era of superpower relations, and in particular tries to grapple with the realities of China's rise. So that's what we're going to talk about this evening. We're delighted also to be joined to discuss this by two excellent panelists. We have Phuong who joins us also from Australia. So she is a senior analyst at ASPI, one of Australia's premier foreign policy think tanks. And joining us for the home team here in Singapore is our own Bilahari in what I think must be one of the most elegant bookline studies to be found in the entirety of our nation. Bilahari will be known to almost everyone on this call. He is the former permanent secretary of the Singaporean Foreign Service, with a range of other titles to his name, and also the author of a forthcoming book on a similar topic to this. So what we're going to do this evening is Sebastian is going to introduce his book for about 10 minutes and give us a sense of the themes. Then I'm going to ask each of our respondents to respond to that for about 5 minutes each. Then we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves for a little bit, and then I'll open it up to audience questions. So please use the Q&A function if you would like to ask questions. A prize, or at least commendation from the chair, will go to the person who asked the first question, so we're always grateful for that. You won't be able to ask your questions in person, I'm afraid, but I will look down the list, and I will pick a good selection of as many questions as we can to be going on with. So anyway, so I'm going to hand over to Sebastian. His book is already for sale in Kinokuniya here in Singapore. So if you are inspired to buy it, as you should be, because it's an excellent read, then you can go and buy it or order it there. And for those of you who are joining us from outside of Singapore, from the rest of the region or the world, I think the book comes out at the end of this week or next week. So Sebastian will be able to give you a plug of his own. So Sebastian, why don't you begin? Give us a sense of the kind of broad themes of the book and how you came to write it, and then we'll kick off our discussion. But thank you very much for being here, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, James, for that very generous introduction. This is the first chance I've had to speak about the book since its publication, and I think I'm very privileged to be doing so. With such a panel of a distinguished panel. So I very much appreciate it. My first entry point into the question of China's expanding influence in Southeast Asia came while I was working as a journalist in Cambodia. I arrived there in 2008 and worked for 3 years on a local paper. And Cambodia, while it's often overlooked by a lot of international press, it offered a very interesting angle on the shifting balance of power and prestige in Southeast Asia. Cambodia has become, in some ways, notorious of late for its, enthusiastic embrace or at least the government's enthusiastic embrace of Chinese largesse. And it's often spoken of as a client state of Beijing. But I think, I think Cambodia offers some important lessons about the changes that China's power has wrought in Southeast Asia. At the start of the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, Cambodia was the subject of a multi-billion-dollar UN peacekeeping mission that sought to mold the country into a democracy. In some ways, it was a symbol of the liberal New World Order that was, that many people believed was coming into being at the end of the Cold War. Flash forward 3 decades, and what we see is in some senses the exact opposite of that, at least in Cambodia's case. And one of the main sort of causes of that, or enablers of that, has been the support that China has offered the present government of Prime Minister Hun Sen. And so while working in Cambodia, I became very interested in the ways that Chinese money and power were reshaping the region. And so I began to, report from further afield, focusing on these questions. So I traveled to most of the nations of ASEAN, and so my intention with this book was to look not just at the impacts of China's rising power in Southeast Asia, many of them deleterious impacts, but also the way that Southeast Asian peoples and governments were responding to that, and the deeper patterns of historical interactions, many of which long predate the establishment of the People's Republic of China, that have shaped and continue to shape Southeast Asian attitudes towards this resurgent power. So in general, I think we can safely assert that a more powerful, ambitious, and belligerent China has posed every nation in Southeast Asia with a similar challenge. How best to navigate and benefit from this new power's rise, particularly its economic reemergence, while at the same time preserving its sovereignty and avoiding succumbing to onerous Chinese demands. Within these broad parameters, each nation has met this challenge in different ways. Within and between countries, there is a great deal of divergence in the way that China is viewed and the sorts of policies that people are advocating to deal with it. But now, with relations between China and the US really in free fall since the advent of President Donald Trump, and competition between the two powers becoming more and more heated and acrimonious, this challenge has become more and more acute, and the balancing act much more difficult for the Southeast Asian nations to sustain. So as my work proceeded on the book, I also became determined to sort of offer a corrective to the views of China that are now ascendant in the West. The research and writing of this book began around about the time that Donald Trump took office at the start of 2017, and has so coincided with a rapid and remarkably bipartisan souring of American views towards China. This new American consensus will be familiar to anybody who reads the mainstream Western press. It depicts China as a predatory power that bullies its neighbors, that seeks to export its authoritarian political system to the world, and uses debt traps to ensnare developing nations. The current U.S. administration, in particular, has been fond of framing the competition with China in categorical and increasingly ideological terms as a global struggle between, the authoritarian half of the world and the free world. And this image is typically set aside an idealized vision of American primacy and the liberal international order that China is allegedly working to supplant. And one of the problems in trying to inject some nuance into this picture is that there is indeed much to be concerned about in relation to Chinese behavior, from the upper reaches of the Mekong River, where Chinese dams are wreaking havoc with the livelihoods of tens of millions of people downstream in Southeast Asia, to its assertions of power in the South China Sea. China is setting off alarm bells across the region, and it is becoming increasingly forceful in the demand that its interests be recognized and acquiesced to. And now part of the concern that Southeast Asian nations have about China is simply a byproduct of its size and proximity. which could be expected to prompt suspicion almost irrespective of the policies of the Chinese state. But of course, the policies of the Chinese state also weigh very heavily in the region, including its past support for communist insurgencies in just about every country in the region, as well as the highly fraught and sensitive question of its relationship to the region's ethnic Chinese diaspora communities. And so, yeah, despite all these concerns about China's increasingly assertive international posture, the view from Southeast Asia is considerably more complicated and anguished than a lot of Western analysts recognize. In most ways, a prosperous and stable China is in Southeast Asia's interest. Certainly, the opposite would be to its detriment. Many Southeast Asians remember well that periods of upheaval and instability in China that have coincided with the collapse of dynasties and the rise of the outbreak of civil wars have translated often into destabilizing flows of people southward. So as much as they might fear its power and suspect its motives, China has become a vital economic partner to virtually every nation in the region, if not the most prominent one. And so in general, the Southeast Asian nations have chosen to participate in Chinese initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, reckoning quite pragmatically that the risks of participating in these initiatives are outweighed by the benefits of taking part in them. And this proximity to China and the economic enmeshment with Southeast Asia makes China something that the nations of the region cannot feasibly ignore or wish away. Proximity does induce a certain amount of suspicion, as I mentioned, but it tends to make the region resistant to signing up to any American-led alliance or coalition of states aimed either explicitly or otherwise at containing China's power. The ascendant Western view also overlooks other important areas of shared interest. Chief among these, I think, is the common anti-colonial heritage and political orientation that binds China with Southeast Asia. Both regions experienced the predations of Western imperial rule and the upsurges of nationalism that rose to challenge it at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the early 20th century. And today, the most notable outgrowth of this is a deep commitment bordering on zeal to the norm of national sovereignty and any behavior by an outside power that is perceived to circumscribe that national sovereignty. And so China's promotion of an international order based on non-interference and national sovereignty represents an important and often overlooked area of overlapping interest with most of the Southeast Asian states. This is true even, if we acknowledge that China's advocacy of these principles is undermined by its own bullying behavior, for example, in the South China Sea. So for all these reasons, the depiction of US-China competition as an all-or-nothing binary struggle has failed to gain much purchase in Southeast Asia. And if I could phrase it succinctly, I think I would say that the mistake the US makes is wanting and presuming that America's adversaries are, say, Southeast Asia's adversaries as well, and expecting the nations to behave accordingly. But in general, as I argue in my book, the region sees no concrete reason why it can't enjoy fruitful ties with China, the US, and other large powers, even if those powers are in disagreement amongst themselves. But all this puts the region in a very uncertain liminal position in a new age of great power competition. The lure and opportunity of China and of engagement with its economy and the fear of its expanding power and the suspicion of its motives currently exist in almost dialectic relationship in many Southeast Asian countries, feeding back and forth into one another and producing a deep and abiding ambivalence about China's reemergence as a great power. As tensions with the US continue to escalate, this is placing an additional strain on Southeast Asia's ability, both as a region and as individual states, to maintain its strategic autonomy. So I think I'll leave it there. I think that should give everybody a good overview some of the themes of the book and some of the arguments that I make. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, thank you, Sebastian. And as you say, the book is admirably balanced between the different sides of this argument, and benefits, as well as sort of sketching out this big picture view, benefits from chapters in which your journalistic wanderings take us throughout the region, and maybe we can dig into that a little bit more. But let me go to our two respondents. So Phuong, can I turn to you first? I mean, you in your academic writing have, in a sense, described China's role in this region as a mixture of inducement and coercion in the way that China has sought to play its role. But can you give us a sense from your perspective of how that story is unfolding, and in a sense what you made of the argument in Sebastian's book?
Thank you, James, and thank you for the invitation. Congratulations to Sebastian for this excellent book, and I'd really rather be at the LKY school right now, the beautiful campus, and I'd really like to be in the region, but with the conditions we are having now worldwide, I'm grateful that we still can be connected and still continue conversation. And it's a very important conversation because things change so much, and I was really pleasantly surprised how Sebastian's book was up to date, really encapsulate the complexity of the context and the history, but it was also very up to date and very current and explaining the recent development. So well done, Sebastian. Once again, congratulations to your very masterful written piece. And I really enjoyed reading it because, as you say, James, I work on this issue on daily basis. I write and read about this, but the book, Sebastian's book, really is a breath of fresh air in a way, because it brings out the stories, brings out the big questions of Southeast Asia being in the middle of a great power competition, but also at the brink of new development, new era, so to speak. But it is also a very it tells a story of everyday people. Sebastian managed to really bring in and do it with ease to show the story of real impact and implications of Chinese presence, for example, or Chinese businesses in different Southeast Asian countries. And obviously, I can't agree more to the main point that Sebastian says, that nowhere is Chinese economy and military emergence as apparent as in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia will be always the first one to live with the consequences of China's rise, the bad ones and maybe the good ones as well. But the Southeast Asian views of China has global implications. And I think the book really very well showcased that, because it shows the complexity of each Southeast Asian countries, how they react to China. Like I said, some real histories of people, not only the policy level or business level, but it goes down to individual cafe owners, for example. And that is a very compelling story, and I really enjoyed reading it because it brings out the depth of the historical connection, the proximity, but also it brings out, while it is set in the Great Power Competition, it brings out Southeast Asian individual national interests. And it's unlike other literature existent in the debate, is not about how Southeast Asian alignment will suit US interests, China's interests. This book is about Southeast Asian individual countries' interests. And it's not like the academic publications where you are to tell a story to prove a theory or a concept. This is a pure story about the countries in Southeast Asia. And I think I also agree with the point that Southeast Asia cannot afford the luxury of binary choices, black and white. It is next door to China. It is vulnerable, but it has also advantages of the historical interaction, of learning from the previous experiences, and also of being attractive enough now that it is not just China that is trying to woo Southeast Asia, but it is actually, like Sebastian said, it is a crowded space from multiple rivals. It's not just US. There is Japan, there's European Union, there's Australia and other South Korea and other players in the region. So it is really, Southeast Asia is not as vulnerable as sometimes in the main debate it shows, and Sebastian's book highlights that. I think what I particularly enjoyed in the book is it brings more of mainland Southeast Asia, unlike in many majority of literature. And I think that comes from what Sebastian just explained, the deep knowledge and strange time in Cambodia, and from there really expanding his interest and knowledge about the region. What I'd like to end up with in a couple of minutes left is that, first of all, Southeast Asia is a fluid region. We used to define it before as the original Southeast Asian, original ASEAN founding members, but now obviously it's extended to 10 with potential 11th member. So Southeast Asia is a region that transforms. It is bigger now than it used to be. It is learning also from experiences. There are models like Sebastian mentioned, like for example, economic model, but also some political model that can be translated into the region. But it's also learning from the past experiences of dealing with great competition. It has gone through the Cold War, it has lived through Cold War, it had made choices back then, it had different policies of alignment back then, it has lived through the US-China rocket drones. Now it is facing another form of competition. So I think the region is fluid, the region is transforming, probably faster than most of us tend to think. And I think the COVID crisis, the pandemic, will fundamentally change a lot of things, including China itself, but including a lot of Southeast Asians. And the relationship after COVID will have to be also redefined. So I'll leave this debate about the post-COVID context to the Q&A session, but I will just end up with one note, Sebastian, that you've finished your book saying that most of the powers had failed to really grapple Southeast Asia, that the Southeast Asian region had slipped through hands of many powers that have been engaged with it. But I think your book proves that you have a pretty grip on what's happening in the region, so congratulations.
Very good. Okay, that's terrific. Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those themes as we progress. So let me hand over to Bilahari. Bilahari, do you want to give your own reflections before we open up for discussion? I should say that we have a few questions, 4 or 5 already in the Q&A. But if any of the rest of you are inspired to ask our panelists a question, do start putting them in now. We'd be grateful. We'll get to as many of them as we can in the Q&A section. But Bilahari, over to you.
Thanks, James. First of all, congratulations, Sebastian. This is a fine work.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading. Now, it's not possible these days to talk about China in Southeast Asia without at least implicitly talking about the US in Southeast Asia. But that said, far too many discussions of China's relations with Southeast Asia, including by some Southeast Asians who ought to know better, seem to assume that our region is inhabited by morons incapable of counting beyond 2. In other words, the choices facing us are only binary. And this is a fundamental misreading of Southeast Asia. Only the simple-minded and probably the partisan assume that one must necessarily win and the other lose, as if the complex international relations of this region could be reduced to a 2-horse race. Of course, Sebastian does not do so. You are not a reductionist. And in his very first chapter, he warns against what he calls the luxury of simple binaries. There's only one other recent work that I know of that has accurately captured the ambivalence, the complexity, the complications and contradictions with which Southeast Asia views China, a relationship that Sebastian accurately describes as fraught. So once again, congratulations, Sebastian. This is a major achievement. Now, sorry, Phuong, since Sebastian is a journalist and not a professor of international relations, he writes in clear and accessible prose that is a pleasure to read. Incidentally, the other recent work that accurately reflects the complex nuances of China's relations with Southeast Asia is also by a journalist. Perhaps because journalists actually go out and look at things rather than imagine things based on theories. That's Under Beijing's Shadow by Murray Hibbert. It's also very readable, and this pair of books are indispensable for anyone interested in the subject. Sebastian, I found myself agreeing with everything you wrote, almost everything you wrote. Maybe some details I would quibble with, but one major quibble, and it's only a quibble, is with the title's description of the 21st century as China's century. Perhaps this was the publisher's term, not yours, but in any case, on whether this will really be China's century, I'll talk a bit more later. I think you put your finger on the core of the issue. As a contiguous big country, China is always going to be influential in Southeast Asia. But for the same reason, for the very same reason, because it is a contiguous big country, China is always going to evoke concern in Southeast Asia. And in this apparent contradiction lies the essence of the relationship. China's rise is a geopolitical fact that cannot be ignored. China's rise is challenging, but also replete with opportunity. China is undoubtedly influential, but distrusted. Now, big countries, if their intentions are indeed benign, have a duty to reassure small countries on their periphery. And this is a duty that China in recent years has failed to perform. On the contrary, Beijing has behaved aggressively in pursuit of its interests. And there is also a certain cultural altruism in Chinese diplomacy in Southeast Asia that has accentuated the anxieties of the region. Chinese diplomats and officials often seem to think that all they need to do is offer generous aid, trade, investment, and all will be well. Well, the economic factor is indeed crucial, as you point out in your book. But not all Southeast Asians are for sale, or if bought, are going to stay bought. And China is beginning to learn that even the venal and corrupt can be nationalist. And it is nationalism that makes Southeast Asia skeptical of both the Chinese and the Americans. The US is also a geopolitical fact that cannot be ignored, but is also not particularly trusted either. An offshore balancer, which the US has been since 1969, the Guam Doctrine, is always going to be regarded warily. Its friends and allies are constantly going to oscillate between fears of abandonment and fears of entanglement. These fears have been accentuated by the Trump administration, but Donald Trump did not invent them, and Joe Biden, if he is elected, is not going to erase them either. In other words, the porridge of the offshore balancer is always going to be too hot or too cold. And no administration, in my experience, has ever got the temperature just right. President Obama made elegant speeches, but clearly had little stomach for the strategic rivalry that is an inescapable reality of major power relations in any system of sovereign states. Whatever you may think of Trump's robust approach towards China, it cannot be accurately described as a retreat that a prevalent trope would have us believe. As the strategic crossroads connecting the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Southeast Asia has always been where the interests of major powers have intersected and sometimes collided. Therefore, significant influence is not exclusive influence or dominant influence. Faced with major powers that cannot be ignored but are not trusted, the countries of Southeast Asia are today responding as they have responded since time immemorial, by dancing, and the steps of that diplomatic dance are intricate. In international relations theory, balancing, hedging, and bandwagoning are alternative strategies. But the diplomatic instinct of Southeast Asia, evolved over centuries of living in the midst of major power rivalry, is to do all three simultaneously. And this is facilitated by the natural multipolarity of a diverse Indo-Pacific in which a diverse Southeast Asia is the linchpin. The US and China are not the only powers that matter. There is Japan, India, Australia, South Korea, Russia, and Indonesia and Vietnam are not inconsiderable strategic actors in regional politics. And a few European countries have the potential to join them. After the Cold War, ASEAN encouraged the natural multipolarity of the region through the establishment of forums such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Plus. These forums anchor all the major powers in Southeast Asia by providing them with a legitimate and institutionalized means of engaging the region. It's often said that Southeast Asia does not want to choose between the US and China and wants to be neutral in their disputes. And this is true. But not choosing does not mean laying low and hoping for the best. We should definitely not be neutral with regard to our own interests. The region's multipolarity creates agency to pursue our own interests because it widens the space and opportunity for maneuver. Of course, whether we have the wit to recognize our agency and the courage and agility to use it is another matter. But in principle, we do have agency. The multipolarity of Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific is not, however, to be understood as a static condition in which all poles are of equal strategic weight. It is asymmetrical and it is dynamic. US-China relations will form the central axis around which other countries, big and small, will continually arrange and rearrange themselves in fluid combinations, sometimes tilting one way, sometimes tilting another way, as their interests in different domains dictate. A static alignment across all domains is improbable. And this century will not be defined by any single country. Thank you and congratulations once again, Sebastian.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Bilahari. That was typically robust. So many thanks for that, and thanks to Phuong as well. So let's dive in. I've already got quite a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I'm going to ask a couple of questions first. So first about China, and then inevitably about the US. So Sebastian, I'll start with you. You may want to respond to what Phuong and Bilahari had said, and please feel free to do so. But I wonder if you could sort of bring us right up to date. So in your afterword of the book, which as Phuong said is very, you managed to sneak a lot in about the current moment, but in a sense, tell us how things stand now. There's a narrative abroad in the West, in India, in other parts of the region that China has become more assertive in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. That's in the South China Sea in this region, but elsewhere as well, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in the Himalayas. I wonder if you and the rest of the panel think that that is an accurate reflection of what's going on as seen from Southeast Asia, or if you describe it in a different way. So Sebastian, first to you, and then I'll go to the other panelists.
I think that impression is mostly borne out. I think that the Chinese Communist Party, after an initial shock when the pandemic tore through parts of central China, have seen the disarray in Western Europe and the United States in its handling of this virus. In that disarray, they've seen what they've always believed about Western liberal democracy, that its time has come and that basically it is now China's time. So I think it's, it went from being, a challenge to the CCP. It was certainly seen like that abroad, but the ruthless handling of the pandemic since then, I think, has emboldened the Chinese leadership to press its advantage on a whole number of fronts. There's no other way really of explaining why they would pick fights simultaneously with Australia, India, the literal states of maritime Southeast Asia, and of course the United States. And I think this has been fueled as well by the sharp deterioration of U.S.-China relations, which were already in a pretty parlous state on the eve of the pandemic. There's a certain irony in the fact that the question of the trade war and trade disputes now seems like the element of U.S.-China relations that is most amenable to a negotiated solution. Everything else from tech to the ideological dimension seems increasingly like a dialogue of the deaf. So yes, I think it is true that China has seized this moment to demonstrate its prowess and that of its political system, and I think that there's a certain amount of reveling in the shambolic response of the Trump administration to this crisis.
Phuong, what's your sense of this, particularly seen from Southeast Asia? I mean, I'm interested in how this moment appears from our region, as it were, as opposed to from Washington or from Canberra. But what's your sense of the way China has been playing its hand in the aftermath of COVID-19? And then I'll go to Bilahari as well.
Well, I think everybody says that the COVID pandemic is not really a change, but it is accelerating the already existing trends. And if it's the case, then it is accelerating Beijing's the trend of being more aggressive. So we've seen that in Xi Jinping's policies, in the Chinese Communist Party policies in recent years to be more assertive already before the pandemic. But the pandemic further accelerated that, and really to the degree that you've mentioned that it is taking up on all fronts, even with the countries they don't have active territorial disputes such as Australia, as you mentioned. But we've seen activities in South China Sea, in Indian border, in you name it. But I think there is an element of that, element of seizing the time where everybody else is preoccupied with the pandemic. But also I think this is, there's a saying that in the pandemic time, 1 month is like 1 year. So that there developments and events happening during the pandemic is such an acceleration. And I think it is an acceleration of the already existing the direction that the Chinese Communist Party has had. But also it is a dangerous game because it can overreach, and already some analysts point to a danger of China overreaching. In Sebastian's book, I think he referred to one of the ways that Vietnamese tend to see China as greedy, and I would say this time, and I'm not saying as an official Vietnamese view, but my view is at the current pace, China continues with that. It is certainly a much greedy approach, trying to reach too many at the same time that can actually turn with the reverse results.
Bilahari, what do you think about this? I mean, so contrary to the kind of prevailing Western view, I was wondering whether in this part of the world, in a sense, in some ways, China has, its response to the pandemic has strengthened the kind of, not quite admiring, but in a sense, can do business approach that many countries in this region, they look and they see strengths within the Chinese system, and certainly one of them has been how China, compared to many other countries, has dealt with the pandemic. So I wonder how you see this narrative about the kind of post-pandemic Chinese behavior.
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with what Sebastian and Phuong have said, but I would like to add a little bit of complexity to it. Look, as I said in my opening remarks, we are not morons in this region. We do not make judgments on strategic alignments because of our perceptions of one dimension or another of any major power. We try to look at things holistically. It's true that the Western response is hardly inspiring. It is true that the Chinese did act very decisively after their initial fumbling, but people do not forget it was the initial fumbling, after all, that allowed the virus to break the boundaries of just Wuhan and China. And I think we should not forget that the economic consequences of the pandemic, even though it had been contained in China, are still with China, as with everybody else. China is going to face a period of slow growth for quite some time to come. I don't know what the growth figures will be like. They didn't publish them this year, or didn't publish a target. And I doubt they will publish a target because they will probably be positive, but in a single digit. And don't forget that more than any other party in this region, the Communist Party of China depends on its economic performance for its legitimacy. Manufacturing is picking up, but can it really pick it up when global demand is so low? And will remain low because all the major economies are in a synchronized recession. Mr. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have made their concerns about unemployment, for example, very clear. They made their concerns about the small and medium-sized industries very clear. And it's not very clear that these areas are recovering. Xi Jinping has talked about relying more on domestic demand, and that's all to the good. But China has been talking about relying more on domestic demand for more than a decade, and the results have been disappointing. It seems to have stuck at about 40% of GDP, domestic demand, domestic consumption, whereas most major economies is between 50 to 60%, right? And there are complex reasons why it's going to be difficult for China to break that barrier. And this slow growth, because the Communist Party depends more than any other on its performance, is a real problem. They worry about social instability, they worry about a whole lot of things, and when they cannot deliver economic performance, they turn to their usual weapon, which is nationalism. And that, I think, accounts as much for their more aggressive stance as, seizing the moment. I think it's much more complex than just seeing that the West and other countries are distracted, let's do it now. They need to do it because they can't deliver what their Chinese people expect of them in terms of the economy, not for some time to come. I'm not saying China is going to collapse, but it's going to be in some economic difficulty for some time to come, just like the rest of us. And so nationalism is their usual response.
I want to sort of deal with both China and the US at the start, and then we can kind of dive in. We've got a lot of questions on the role of ASEAN, which I'll get to in a minute, in a sense, the kind of regional organization. But Bilahari, since you're talking, let me stay with you. You had this rather nice idea of as the countries in the region dancing, that you mentioned both Obama and potentially Biden. So one of the themes of Sebastian's book is basically that the United States and the West gets Southeast Asia wrong. Sebastian, in his afterword, says that this is a blind spot, that the US never seems to be able to have an effective policy in this region. So can you just talk a little bit more about what it is that the US is doing wrong, and then I'll go back to Sebastian and get him to talk a little bit about this as well, and why you think that a potential Biden administration is unlikely to change that.
Well, over many administrations in my entire diplomatic career, when I was working before I retired, the US, and in fact the West in general, never regarded Southeast Asia as important in itself, never dealt with it on its own terms, but as part of a larger framework, whether it is the Cold War framework, or the advance of democracy, or the retreat of democracy, or now US-China. And that's all true, these things are not wrong, but they are simplistic. And that's the fundamental mistake successive governments in the US, successive administrations in the US, and in Europe, and in Australia, by the way, too, have made. I don't see that changing. I didn't see this changing under Mr. Obama. either. It didn't change. Mr. Obama made very nice speeches, but he really, as I said in my opening remarks, had very little stomach for the strategic competition that is a reality of this region, whether it was US, Soviet, or now China, US, right? He mishandles Scarborough Shoal. He mishandled North Korea, I think. Not that Trump is doing much better, right? But when Obama, for example, drew a red line over the use of chemical weapons in Syria, but failed to enforce it, I think people, not just in Southeast Asia, but across the Indo-Pacific, took note of that. And when Mr. Trump decided to bomb Syria over the use of chemical weapons while having dinner with Mr. Xi Jinping, people also took note of that. So I think it's not so simple. Mr. Biden, how he is going to conduct his foreign policy, what his foreign policy will be like, is still quite unknown. But I don't think, as far as China is concerned, it's going to be fundamentally different from Trump. He may be more inclined, he may be less trigger happy on the tariffs, which is all to the good, but I don't think he's going to relent on the technology, and in particular on semiconductors, which is a serious vulnerability of China, as Chinese are discovering today. So I don't see any administration letting go of that. And in that, there is both challenges and opportunities for the region.
Phuong, before we go back to Sebastian, do you have a quick thought on, in a sense, why it is that the US and the West have in a sense failed in many ways to respond to China's rise in this region?
Well, I think Southeast Asia for US is like Bilahari mentioned. It is has a function, right? But it is on its own. It's too small, too far away, and if not for the context of the competition with China, probably wouldn't have a dedicated policy towards that. We didn't have a sitting US president visiting Laos since the war until Obama came. We didn't have a number of, even Malaysia, it was like several decades. Right now, in the current administration, even though I have proclaimed about ASEAN centrality and the role of Southeast Asia in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and acknowledge Southeast Asia as an arena of competition, we still have quite a few ambassadorial posts empty, including in Singapore. So it is really hard to capture U.S. attention if not for the bigger things. U.S. likes big things, and China is big enough to encapsulate its attention. And I think that's actually the value of Sebastian's book, because he brings out the agency of those smaller countries, that each of them, although they grapple with China's rise as a whole, and it's the theme of the book, but each of them in a very different way. And his stories tell that because they are formed by the historical context that have formed their relationship. So U.S. doesn't have the advantages of proximity like China, and it has to pay extra attention to be in the region and to engage. And often, it doesn't have enough of patience with so many competing priorities. So in a way, it's not entirely surprising, right? And also there is this factor of the Vietnam War has been there. It came with big plans and big strategies. They never got it right, and after the war, there was a scar in the U.S. Psyche, and for a long time, there's a lot of people in the U.S. who didn't want to touch Southeast Asia until the recent resurgence of the competition with China. So again, it brings back to the China problem, I think. And I'm not going to take too much of Sebastian's time, but I think just to end up on the note that Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said recently, his worries about the U.S. policy in Asia is that it's either competing with China or no Asia at all. So So I think that's a worry that many Southeast Asians share.
Okay, very good. We've got a lot of questions to get through, but Sebastian, do you want to, in a sense, you conclude your book by giving some advice for the West in particular, the gist of which was, if I were to be unkind about it, is, stop preaching about human rights and in a sense talk about interest rather than values. Is that a fair characterization of your view, or is that a bit simplistic?
Probably a bit simplistic. I mean, I think that there is potentially, or there should be, a role for values in Western policy towards the region. But I think there's a fine line between being seen to preach and being very self-righteous and engaging constructively with Southeast Asian states. And I think that the real need for Western countries is to see Southeast Asia on its own terms. I think Bilahari is absolutely correct in emphasizing that the region has always been seen as a proxy for a wider struggle. And of course, I know this particularly well, having been based in Cambodia for so long, because I think of all the Southeast Asian nations, Cambodia is probably the one that tendency has been most marked in. And so I think, as long as Western nations continue to view the region as a proxy for a broader struggle between the forces of democracy and the forces of authoritarianism, they're going to encounter pushback and obstacles. I think, one pattern that I note throughout the book is that when Western nations are most forceful on questions of democratic backsliding or human rights, China generally reaps a strategic dividend. Now, that dividend is not a permanent one, and the suspicion and fear of China tends to complicate the situation. But it does mean that this is a persistent pattern that we see. It's something almost approaching an iron law in Southeast Asia over the past decade or so. And I think this is where the forces of nationalism really assert themselves into the equation. I think that the US and China in some ways mirror one another in their inability to take the interests and perceptions of small nations seriously. Both superpowers are now beadily eyeing each other off across the Pacific Ocean. And, the great irony, I think, is that, Southeast Asia, which is in many ways the quintessential Indo-Pacific region, is really sits downstream of this broader rivalry. And you see that in everything from the Chinese government's insistence on viewing the Philippines as a glorified American aircraft carrier and denying the agency of the Philippines government and people, their ability to have an independent stance independent of the United States. And you also see it, with the United States, after, years of ignoring Cambodia, is now, obsessed with this idea that the Chinese are establishing a military base in the country. And then there's all sorts of frenzied discussions going on about, how to punish the government for having allowed that to take place. So, I think it's very important to understand the histories of the 11 Southeast Asian nations, their turbulent encounter with Western imperialism, the nation-building challenges that they still grapple with, many of which are can be directly connected to the experience of imperial rule, and the deep ambivalence about Western powers, including the United States, which that experience has inculcated. I think that there is a strong tendency to suspect, as Bilahari said, both superpowers and their intentions. And you see this, this came out quite clearly in the reactions to the American campaign against Huawei, the attempt to, the demand really that American allies forswear Chinese 5G technology. Very few nations have actually complied with that. The Vietnamese did so, but probably would have done so anyway, given their deeply entrenched suspicions of China. And it showed, some of the reactions of Southeast Asian leaders, including the former foreign minister of Singapore, George Yeo, and Prime Minister Mahathir, as he then was in Malaysia, seemed to indicate that they viewed China and the United States with an equal amount of suspicion. And I think, I think that this needs to be taken into account by Western governments if they wish to craft a sophisticated and effective policy towards China and Southeast Asia and great relationships in the region.
Okay, super. All right, let's we've got a whole host of questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is try and get through as many as possible, reasonably rapid fire. So I'm going to beseech my panelists to give concise answers, and let's see how many we can go through. So there's a cluster of questions about the role of ASEAN. So let's see if we can bite off a couple of these, and I'll throw them out at individual panelists. So Sebastian, you're speaking. So the very first question was from Qisiang Ng, who's I think a journalist, if I get this right, here in Singapore, writing to The Edge. So for a long time, the idea of giving great powers a greater stake in regional affairs has been a cornerstone of defending ASEAN's regional security. With great power relations now more fraught, is great power presence in the region now a greater cause of instability rather than stability? So has ASEAN's approach of inviting in the big powers and giving them a stake, is that now under question? Yes or no? What do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think that to some extent, ASEAN's strategy was, really the only strategy open to it. I think that, collectively and individually rather, the nations of Southeast Asia are, too small to have an appreciable impact on the great powers. It's only together, acting in concert, that they can create generate some sort of meaningful agency, strategic agency. And I think that the policy of trying to bind the larger powers in these webs of multilateral symmetry has, I think the successes of that have tended to be underrated. But when large powers, begin to compete with one another directly, ASEAN doesn't have this diplomatic web is not necessarily strong enough to contain the interests and ambitions of larger powers. And so, I don't know that this is something that should be discarded simply because the US and China and other powers in the region are beginning to compete with each other more vociferously. I think that, the line on ASEAN that I take in the book is that it, for all its flaws, it's the best thing the region has. And perhaps regional statesmen and women should invest more time and energy in trying to make it work more effectively in certain ways. But I do think that, ASEAN, to the extent that Southeast Asia has a regional vehicle for, a strategic vehicle, ASEAN and its associated diplomatic processes, I think, will be central.
Bilahari, another question from a journalist or a former journalist. So Jeremy Grant, I presume it's the same Jeremy Grant who used to be a journalist here in Singapore, talked about China's breaking of the ASEAN consensus beginning in Sebastian's former home, Cambodia, in 2012, in the ASEAN summit then. And he asked, fast forward to 2020, and how do you assess China's success in breaking down the ASEAN consensus? Or indeed, would you describe that as China's objective?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think it is in China's interest to break up ASEAN. It is in China's interest to try to capture ASEAN. In 2012, working through a particularly stupid foreign minister, Ho Nam Hong, who didn't even know his own interest, was merely venal, they blocked an ASEAN consensus on one issue, the South China Sea. They blocked it for about a week, whereupon I think common sense, even in Cambodia, reasserted itself, and a minimal consensus was a bit belatedly reestablished. I don't think we can get beyond that minimal consensus on the South China Sea, but it is a consensus. It serves no Chinese purpose to break up ASEAN. They want to capture it. But it's also, taking a historical point of view, worthwhile reflecting on one historical fact which the Chinese and the Americans have not quite hoisted in, I think. And that there is never been a period, except for a short and extremely exceptional period during the Second World War, where Southeast Asia has been under the sway of any single power. It is just too complicated a region. It is just too intransigent a region, if you like, to be held in totality by one single power. And that short exceptional period of the Japanese occupation did not end well. Let me just add one more point, which has to do much more with the previous question. The previous ASEAN regional security concept, Zopfan, was that all the region's ills were due to the interference of major powers in this region. It's a superficially plausible and attractive concept, but actually quite stupid in practice because totally impractical. How do you keep them out? So better to embrace them. It doesn't always work very well, you know, that's true. There are two extremes. If there was perfect agreement between all major powers, it's not good for the region because there will be no space to maneuver. But if there is war, total competition, total war between major powers, that's also not good for the region because there is no space to maneuver. So some degree of tension is not a bad thing for the region. And we can argue whether there's too much tension, too little tension, but you know, just to end up my point, even in this heightened state of tension, there is agency. Take the Huawei decision. It's not a binary decision. Look at what Singapore did. Singapore, two major service providers who just happened by coincidence to be owned by the government, or the government is the major shareholder in them, decided on their own volition not to use Huawei as the major for the island-wide 5G network. But Huawei was not banned from bidding for anything. And one minor service provider, an Australian one, is apparently going to use Huawei for some local networks, you know, in a hotel or shopping mall. So that, you know, even in a rather fraught situation, there is always agency, provided you have the wit to see it and the ability to use it.
Very good. Okay, let me ask Phuong a question. So my colleague at the Lee Kuan Yew School, Yongwook Woo, is an ASEAN specialist. And so he says he agrees with the author and the panelists that the binary choice framework misses a lot. But he says, isn't the problem that Southeast Asian countries are adopting their own approaches rather than coordinating a regional approach to this great power competition? And I think he's referring in particular to the 2019 sort of ASEAN approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific, which he describes as little more than avoiding a regional approach to great power rivalry. Do you have views on that? In a sense, I know that sitting in Australia, you look at the wider context of Southeast Asia within the framework of the Indo-Pacific, which a lot of people talk about.
Yeah, so one of the actually attractive point of Sebastian's book is that he really limits space for the ASEAN. He does mention the function and utility and the role of ASEAN to many of the countries, in fact, most of the countries in the region, but Sebastian, you focused on the national agency rather than ASEAN. And I think it is an important point because ASEAN, while I'm not questioning any of our ASEAN utility here at this point, but it does sometimes give an artificial feeling of sense of unity and a sense of regionness. And that's what actually misleads a lot of external actors because they think it is treated, you know, ASEAN can represent the Southeast Asia and each of Southeast Asia's interests in a complete way, and it doesn't. And in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, yes, there are a lot of criticism about it, but I think it was a useful diplomatic response to the Indo-Pacific debates, in Indo-Pacific concepts and strategies, and I say them in plural, not in singular. It was a useful way of responding, but whether the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific really will guide the region's development, the region's alignment politics, the region's security, I don't really think so, because it really what it is offering and reiterating the already the norms and plans of action and views and visions that ASEAN have been debating for years in different names, under different names, ASEAN Vision 2020, ASEAN Hanoi Declaration, and so on and so forth. So the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific really is just another way of reiterating the norms and rules that have been guiding the region for a long time. So I wouldn't put too much weight on the document itself. How it is going forward from now on is so, right, could really add to the substance and be really an important guideline to how they respond to the competition. But as it is for now, I think it's more of a diplomatic use.
Very good. Okay, excellent. So we have a question from Richard Borsuk. Richard was, again, another writer around the region, wrote a very good book about Indonesian tycoons. And Richard asked, in your opening remarks, Sebastian, you mentioned the ethnic Chinese communities in Southeast Asian countries, and indeed you touch on this often in the book. Can you elaborate on what you learned during the book on the current relations and feelings between these communities and Beijing? Do you think unhappiness with China's posture in places like Indonesia will create new tensions? And I'd also like to ask this question to Bilahari as well, given he has touched on these themes in his public writing and speaking. So Sebastian, the Chinese diaspora, how does this play into this?
This is probably one of the most sensitive and potentially combustible dimensions of China's engagement with Southeast Asia. During the research of this book, I was surprised to discover the extent to which the relationship between Beijing and the overseas Chinese is a subject of intense anxiety and concern, especially in archipelagic Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia and Indonesia. I think it's important to recognize that this is an issue that long predates the foundation of the People's Republic of China. This dates back to the early 20th century when the Qing dynasty claimed all ethnic Chinese abroad as citizens of China and subjects to its laws. And the anxieties were further stoked by the political activities of many overseas Chinese who partook and played very important roles in the dramas that were roiling their homeland in the 1920s and 30s. And so, from that period, from the First World War onwards, there was restrictions were imposed across the region by the independent government of Siam, as well as the European colonial governments, who viewed ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia as potentially subversive. And this is one of the reasons that Southeast Asian governments were so concerned about China's, the People's Republic of China's evangelism of communism throughout the region, intersected with this question of the loyalties of the overseas Chinese and the fear that Beijing, Mao's China, was seeking to harness these loyalties and use them to make, to foment revolution and overthrow the newly independent governments of the region. And this, this question of, what role the ethnic Chinese play in Southeast Asia continues to be one of great concern. I think that as I said, it's especially notable in the Muslim parts of Southeast Asia, particularly Malaysia, where the ethnic Chinese make up a significant proportion of the population. Indeed, on the eve of Malayan independence, made up nearly half of the population of Peninsular Malaya. And in Indonesia, where the Chinese have always been seen, or at least have been seen by a dominant strand of Indonesian nationalism, to sit outside the national community, to be alien to that conception of Indonesianness, defined in many cases by Islam. And so, in these countries, both of which have disputes with China in the South China Sea, the question of maritime disputes, in my experience, fades in comparison to the question of what Beijing is doing, either real or imagined, to try and harness the overseas Chinese communities in those nations to advance its strategic aims in the region. And I think what we're seeing is a really combustible mix of two things coming together. You have, on the one hand, Xi Jinping's China is making increasingly muscular attempts to harness the overseas Chinese. In its rhetoric, it's beginning to describe them as part of the great Chinese family and call upon them to help build the Chinese dream and achieve the great national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And so it's increasing its outreach and its attempt to convert these economic ties and cultural affinities into political allegiances. On the other hand, we see a rising tide of populism in the Muslim parts of Southeast Asia, which runs the risk of conflating concerns about China's rising power in Southeast Asia with these dormant fears and suspicions about the dual loyalties of the overseas Chinese. It's a very complex issue, but I think that, it poses, two things flow from this. One is that this is going to be a persistent complication in China's relationship with many of the Southeast Asian states. One that I'm not sure that the leadership in Beijing quite recognizes. The second is that it could boomerang on the overseas Chinese communities themselves. The perception of being that they are a fifth column or are somehow inherently loyal to China by virtue of their ancestry and culture is a meme which is remarkably durable and persistent in certain corners of the Indonesian and Malaysian nationalist fringe. And recently, these ideas have broken out into the open in both countries in concerning ways. And so I think we're finding many of the overseas Chinese communities are finding themselves increasingly squeezed by these two converging forces.
Bilahari, we're running up against time here. I promised everyone we get finished by 6:30, but do you have a quick thought on the issue of the diaspora? You've warned in public about the risks of Chinese influence operations and that sort of thing.
In my opening remarks, I had, in passing, referred to the cultural altruism of Chinese diplomacy in Southeast Asia. And what I was really alluding to was their use of the overseas Chinese. It is sometimes incredibly stupid. They should know better than anybody else how sensitive an issue this is. And they did know. In 1955, they separated the Huaren from the Huaqiao, and they said, basically, go be good citizens of your country, right? But under Xi Jinping, they seem to merge these two concepts again. And so it leads to behavior that really baffles me, because it is so incredibly stupid, and these are not stupid people. The most egregious example is what happened during the Malaysian general election in 2018. You remember? The Chinese ambassador, for some reason, thought it was a jolly good idea to go and campaign for the head of the Malayan Chinese Association in his own constituency. How is this a good idea? But he apparently thought it was a good idea and did so, and of course the poor bugger lost. Now, this is a serious liability, and I can only explain it because Mr. Xi Jinping has said that all Chinese should support the Chinese dream, and his minions go out faithfully, but not very thinkingly, to carry out his bidding. This is going to cause big trouble for China in Southeast Asia unless they are very careful. And it's not just Malaysia and Indonesia, by the way. Myanmar too.
Very good. Okay, so we're bang on 6:30, and I pity the event chair, even with a great book to promote, who gets between people and their dinner. So I don't want to do that. But my apologies. We had a lot of great questions which I didn't have time to get to. But thank you for putting them in there, Sebastian. Saw them. I'm sorry we didn't quite get to them, but we got a few, and I think that was a rich and interesting discussion. So many thanks both to Bilahari and to Phuong for their contribution, but particularly congrats to Sebastian. We're very pleased to host what I'm sure will be the first of many events on this book as you unfurl the publicity campaign on all continents, albeit virtually when you're stuck in Australia. Congratulations again on the book. Those of you who are watching, as I said at the beginning, you can buy the book either from Amazon or you can pop down to Kinokuniya if you're here in Singapore. And with that, I would like to thank you all for coming to join us this evening. If you have a little bit of time, our organizers have left a survey for you to fill out in the chat, which we'd be grateful for. And there will be other events that the Lee Kuan Yew School is running during this academic term and beyond. So please feel free to sign up to our mailing list. With that, congratulations again, Sebastian, and thank you very much for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye, Sebastian, Phuong, James.
Bye.
See you again.
It was a great panel. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it was nice. Thanks.